Hi, Neil Friedman here from the Berg F. Um, Part of the research that I'm doing, or part of the research that I'm interested in, is really focusing on the nutrition environment, the food environment, and the cellular processes by which the food we eat impacts our health outcomes, our health span, and our lifespan, and our ability to deal with and respond to pathogens or disease. So, in relation to this, there's two things that I've saw recently, two completely separate publications. One is the study that was on the screen at the moment, which I'll run through, and the second one was a article from an investment firm, which I'll talk about in a few moments. So, these were two completely different articles, publications from different sources, not no way related. But for me, they tie up a little bit together to come through to help answer one of the really big questions that I think is being debated at the moment. And that big question is the responsibility, or where responsibility lies for bad diets and what we're eating. So there's one school of thought which is really sort of following on the sort of libertarian way of thinking, which is saying it's the responsibility sits with the individual. You decide what you eat, and it's up to you to eat healthy. As against the other side of that probably being a really sort of a paternal way of thinking, which is kind of the thinking that it's the state's responsibility to make sure you eat properly. So I kind of sit not to the far side of the paternal way of thinking, but slightly focus on that side. I do think we all have a responsibility to make sure that we live a healthy lifestyle, but I also think that the state is responsible for the food environment which we're exposed to, and in that regard, they have a responsibility to make sure that not that there's the elimination of bad choices. People still need to be able to have a choice. There's still, we still need treats every now and then, etc. But that the way that people eat in terms of what we consider the normal foods that we eat, the day-to-day meals, not snacks, not sweets or treats, um, there is a requirement to make sure that environment is leaning towards health and health span and improved responses to illness. So this particular study that you can see was published on the 21st of April of this year, 2023, used a machine learning model to try and or to predict or to work out the level of processed foods that we eat and the level of processed foods in the food environment. It's an American study, so that used the American food environment. So I'm not going to go through the whole study in detail, but let's just highlight some of the key points here. And the first one is this around this process over here. So using their algorithm that they've used, they were able to say that their algorithm predicted or indicated that over 73% of the US food supply is considered ultra processed. Just think about that. Over 73% of the food on the shelves within a typical US supermarket is highly ultra processed food. And there is really, really good research, some of it indicated a bit further down in the study, about the negative effects of eating ultra processed food. So that's kind of the first thing in this article that's really just jumped out. So I'm not going to go through everything in here. I'm not going to do a review of the study, but I just want to give you some of the graphs and pictures that I thought for me were really, really key indicators. And this block over here, marked C, I think is really relevant. So if we have a look over here, this is taking a raw onion, saying that's an onion that comes out the ground. On their food processing score, which is ranked from 0 to 1, a raw onion out the ground, as you can see, is right up there at 0. It's a food. Um, Maybe it's not completely on the 0 0 mark because possibly there's some fertilizer or something in there. That's me predicting. I haven't read that in the study, by the way. Um, we can then see that if we take that raw onion, we buy it fresh from the supermarket, and then we boil it at home. We boil it from fresh. Well, that act of boiling it is processing the food. So we actually take that up from a score of 0 to a score of 0.3, 0.3. Um, which becomes an indicator that we've now started to process that food, but obviously we haven't made the food unhealthy at this point. And if we take onions which are boiled from frozen, so again, just straight uh, raw onions that we've frozen and taken them out. Obviously, the process of freezing them and unfreezing them is another process. So we've gone up on the score there slightly, but not a lot. If we then take that same onion and now we're going to fry it, all right, or saute it. Now we've gone to the point where we're starting to move towards the pink. So we're starting to look at a process which maybe we're even still doing ourselves at home, but it's starting to move the onion across in terms of this processing score. And the reason for that is, what are we processing it in, or what are we frying it in? So is it a vegetable oil? Obviously, we're chemically changing the product a lot more when we're frying it um, in oil. So that process of now frying the onion has really taken it or elevated it to a point where it's probably somewhere in the mean in terms of health. But if we move across over here, because this is where our hubris and our natural laziness and the way that we're encouraged to shop today makes a difference. Because here is if we buy onion rings from the supermarket, ready prepared, ready made onion rings, that all we need to do is drop at home. So those onion rings have now been preserved. Remembering that the priority for the supermarket is for products that they have that they own effectively, because they've bought it, but you haven't bought it from them yet. They want those products to stay, their shelf life to be as long as possible. So there are processes involved with processing those foods and the packaging, which then take it into a highly processed food. And if we move slightly across the ladder or across the rung there, we can see that frozen rings, frozen onion rings, those are ready prepared frozen onion rings. So they've gone through the chemical process of preserving it. They've also been covered in some form of breadcrumb, which won't be a real breadcrumb. It'll be I'm going to say synthetic, but it'll be a further processed product. Um, Very often, I know this is true. I don't know if it's true for onion rings. I know it's true for things like oven fried chips. Part of the process by which oven fried chips are partially cooked and then frozen is they get coated in a layer of sugar. Um, not because they want them to taste sweet, but because that prevents the chips from or the fries from browning in the process before they freeze them. So that's quite important. And also, when you then oven cook them, that gives them the golden color, because actually it's the sugar caramelizing, that thin layer of sugar caramelizing on the outside that helps change the color. Obviously, you've got the natural sugars in the potato as well. But yeah, let's talk about the onion rings here, which also have obviously natural sugars in them. We can just see, really importantly, the difference here between an onion out the ground being non-processed and the way many of us, or many people, uh, access ready-made fried onion rings that come out of a frozen packet, and then quickly cooked either in an oven or in the oven. Um, Looking across just to that screen over there, just to touch on this little aspect over here. So this is taking that processing score and saying that a point 0.5 represents the mean or the medium. So that's the average. So most products that we buy in sit with, are highly processed, but sit within this environment over here. And we can see things like natural berries obviously sit very much on the left of the median, I would say, is the healthier option. And if we scale all the way down or slide all the way down to let's go slightly higher up on that. Things like ready-made breakfast cereals. So I'm talking about Cocoa Pops or Rice Krispies. You can sit right there on the highly processed scale. And you can see there's some further indications of products far right in the far right here, which are things like, especially things like ready-made breads and things, or bread. So obviously, the zero in here will be a wheat in the field, and then as you go through the process of extracting the wheat, milling the wheat into flour, and then everything that gets done to the flour, which ultimately ends up in a piece of bread, that all then becomes, that's all processing and brings it right across the score. So this particular product, that this particular study, was evaluating this machine learning process that they've got, or that they've developed, to be able to rate the how processed individual items of food are. And just to touch on the other little bit of this particular study before I move on to the next article that relates to that, is what are the health implications? All right. So again, they've justified in this research what they've used to be able to correlate their data with. Um, and I think we'll touch a bit more on this in the next study. But obviously, we know that highly processed foods are associated with both metabolic and cardiovascular risk. Um, so we can see that things like metabolic syndrome, diabetes, all associated with foods that are highly processed. And we also know that the health implications form in family clusters, and that would make sense because most families eat together. So potentially there's an implication here that when we see something like heart disease following a familial line down a family, of course, there's a genetic component to that, but we may need to consider that it's not just the genes that predispose uh, each generation to heart disease, but potentially it's the fact that each generation educates the next generation in terms of what they eat or what they feed them. So it might be that eating highly processed foods or just not eating well also goes down the familial line. So that's worth considering as well, although that's clearly not the subject of this particular um, paper. They were more looking at the chemical exposure of the products to through the processing uh, uh, process. So that's what I'm going to talk about on this particular paper. So basically, just showing using this paper, and I'll put the title back on the screen at the moment if anybody wants to search for it. Um, the purpose of this was really to show also was the development of a score for processing, an acceptable score, and then using an algorithm that was developed and using that score to be able to evaluate the level of highly processed foods that sit in the typical, in this case, American diet. So we can see from that particular paper that there's this link. There's the fact that the bulk of our food is considered highly processed, and there's this link that highly processed foods leads to negative health outcomes. So the question becomes a simple one: if we know that highly processed foods are associated with bad health and bad health outcomes. And of course, there's a negative implication to the state to have to then look after the people that are sick. And we have a loss of productivity and losses to the workforce for these reasons. Um, why don't we just change the food environment? Why are highly processed foods um, allowed to continue? Why are we seeing more and more highly processed foods? Why are we not seeing some form of regulation to scale that back? And the second article, which wasn't a paper, it was an article, which I want to discuss, um, provides some of the answers for that, but also the fact that this article is written by an investment corporation, BNP Paribas. As you'll see, maybe there's an indicator um, that there is a change in conscience and potentially um, things are going to change because investors might be insisting on that change. So let's have a look at that one. So, really importantly, this article was written by this Rachel Crossley over here, who is an employee of BNP Paribas, and BNP are an asset management company. So, yeah, involved in hedge funds and investing and looking after investor interests, which is really really interesting because that's very much from a commercial standpoint, if you like, from a business standpoint. All right, so what this particular article does, and this is their relevance, is it talks about the power of lobbying. So, to answer the question that I proposed a few moments ago, what is stopping the change? Why are we seeing a continued inertia towards more and more um, highly processed products, and why aren't we seeing a change despite the known links to poor health and lack of productivity? And the reason for that is we see that the food industry represents or has very very powerful lobbying groups that are able to influence or stop the change towards government policy. So even in our current environment, we know that there was government policy um, that was due a couple of months back around the food environment and food advertising and junk food advertising, etc., and that all of that policy has been put on hold. And the reason it's been put on hold is because the food industry, or the big food industry, was able to use the current economic climate, and prior to that, the pandemic climate, to really powerfully lobby the pausing of the implementation of these, and even potentially, if we as a society are not careful, the reversal and of these new policies so that they don't become implemented. So that's really important. And the point that's made in this opening paragraph of this particular article actually draws a parallel with the green messaging and environmental messaging. And the point being made was that, or is that, um, investors within large organizations, so the big investment organizations, big investment groups, the people that represent our pension schemes and the hedge funds, etc., started drawing attention to businesses that funds were going to follow those companies that had a green agenda. So people that were investing, or not necessarily investing, but who were taking advantage of carbon offsets and changing potentially packaging materials, and reducing their carbon exposure, etc., etc., etc. Money was going to go in those directions, and as a result of that, many organizations changed their policies, changed what they were doing, to fit that agenda in order to attract that investment and to retain that investment. And the suggestion here in this particular article is that now it's in time for investor groups, investor groups to do the same thing, with the big food industry, and government's not going to change it. And while the evidence is accumulating, there is already enough to say that if we want to see a more productive society, we want to include health span, we want to include increased lifespan, then we need to change the makeup of our foods. We need to reduce this drive towards highly processed foods, and that it's time maybe for companies to make changes in this direction if they want to continue to attract investment funds. And that's really the point of this article, was that's how we change these lobbying groups, not by trying to counter lobby them, but by trying to actually follow the money, so to speak, or move where the real power is. Remembering that in reality, although most organizations, most companies, and I use the word most, always talk about having three stakeholder groups: investors, staff, and customers. Legally, of those three groups, the only group that they are legally bound to, or to facilitate, is group number one, which is their investors, right? So companies are legally obliged to be work in the interests of their investors. So ultimately, it's the investor community that will have the influence to be able to make changes or to drive change within within the big food companies. Again, just don't want to go on for too long here, but really, this particular graph over here just looks at current obesity rates, according to the World Health Organization, and really you can see from the text underneath that there's no signs of that slowing. So there's an expected rise of more than 4 billion people globally. It's 51% increase in obesity over the next 12 years, in 12 years' time, according to research by the World Obesity Federation that's being quoted over here. So that's really important. And we can see what that obesity actually means in terms of us. What does it really mean to us? So I think as a human being, there's two things that that really concern us: is living long, so not dying, to put it very bluntly, but also living for many years in good health. All right, so we can see here leading causes of diet-related deaths and illness globally, and this was for the year 2017 in millions. So um, we can see heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and cancers, and we can see the number of deaths associated with those. So for heart disease, 10 million. But this over here is your dailies, which is your disability adjusted life years. All right. So we can see the number of life years, 207 million life years lived in a disabled state or in a unhealthy state as a result of diet. That's just heart disease. Type 2 diabetes, we can see 24 million years collectively. Um, 0.3 million deaths associated, and here's cancer. So we can see the numbers there that this particular article is referring to in terms of driving and driving that change. All right, and they're going here that one of the main reasons for poor diet is the lack of access to and affordability of healthy and unprocessed foods. So they're directly linking this now to the processed foods, the processing of foods that we spoke about in the last article. And however, in terms of what's holding back the change, evidence is mounting that food and beverage companies are directly and through trade associations obstructing, preventing, and weakening policy proposals. This is despite more and more of them committing to supporting public health and nutrition and urging sector wide progress. All right. So really this whole article is driving towards something here called ATNI, which I must admit I hadn't heard of prior to reading this, which is really looking at how we change investor expectations, or setting the investor expectations in terms of where investors and those people that control large amounts of investment funds are looking to invest funds in the future. And without going through all of this over here, again, you can see some of the references used for this, uh, you know, and they mention that we've begun engaging with some of the rated companies held in our portfolios using these results, and this is what BNP Paribas are looking to encourage their investors to do, which is 3 points there: set high level commitments to lobby in support of public health policy measures rather than against it, translate them into actions through effective management systems, and be open and transparent about the activities through comprehensive disclosure. Can't argue with any of those three. So again, I'll just go back to the top so we can have a look. You can have a look at the link there at the article. But really, what this particular article is stressing, and I say I'm fully on board with it, is that it is the lobbying of mostly the big food industries that is blocking the change that we need, and that if we want to stop that lobbying, in fact, start lobbying in the other direction, then the key bit here is that, in the same as was done with the green agenda, we need to now start making sure that investors come on board and saying we're going to invest in those food companies that encourage healthy changes to food production to improve human health span, and in so doing, improve the economy by improving um, productivity and number of working years, etc. So that's really what I wanted to cover in this little video. I've got to be honest with you, my target was to do a 10 to 12 minute video, and I've now probably just doubled that, I think, by the time I've clipped it all together. But really, this is the point I wanted to try to make, was that highly processed foods are known to have deleterious health consequences for society. We know that one of the biggest blockages to changing policy around highly processed foods is related to the lobbying power of the food industry, and that the ability to change that really comes from the ability to get investors on board with a change. And that brings me to the final piece, which is, where do we fit into the puzzle at the Berg F? Well, the Berg F is a not-for-profit social enterprise, really looking at channeling social impact funding into developing the future science and scientists involved in health research. But more than that, also, how do we expedite the ability for the results of that science to then become channeled into policy organizations that can make a real difference into communities immediately. And the Berg F as we start to churn out our science and scientists of tomorrow, the idea is that we will then form a rapid process by which health findings and health research can be developed at a community level into improving health and health span. And if you want to be part of that, then I will put a link into the clip for this video for how organizations of any size who have social impact funding that you wish to consider pointing towards the work that we're doing at the BergF. And also, how do you get a marketing return for that? Because we know that social impact funds also require a value to the organizations that are putting them forward. So that is all covered in the link that I'll provide as to how you can get involved with that. So thank you for listening to the video. Hopefully we'll be creating some more of these going forward. I'm Neil Friedman, Co-Executive Director of the BergF. Thank you. Bye-bye.